Okay, so the first part of this module one was about what is an economy. At a rudimentary level, we wanted to know what even that thing is. In part two, we're going to start looking at how people conceived the economy. How did it work? What was it composed of? What happens if you poke it right here? Does it go over there? What does it do? So, to do that, we're going to begin in the modern period of European history. This modern period was called the period of enlightenment. And what happened during the modern period is that the previous rule of kings and gods in Europe was being challenged by things like science, democracy, and rationality in a big cultural movement. So, one of the main figures of the European Enlightenment was this guy, Adam Smith. And he's central because he's known as the father of economics. That period of enlightenment was a period in which the world was ruled by kings. Who appointed those kings? Gods. So you've got Europe ruled by kings. And then Europe had colonies ruled by those kings. Colonial empires were not just ruled by kings, but a new class of people emerged with a lot of wealth during that time, and these were the merchants. Merchants are people who make money by buying stuff in one place and selling it for more money in somewhere else. So these colonial merchants made a lot of money during colonial periods and became powerful. The problem for the merchants was that the kings and the royalty and the aristocracy remained in power politically in Europe and therefore in the colonial world. So the ideas they started, of course, the merchants had money to pay for ideas and thoughts, thinkers to create their theories. So European merchants started to fuel this fury of study in what we call the Enlightenment. And a lot of this centered on freedom from totalitarian rule. You got ideas like democracy emerging, right? You get ideas like free markets emerging. The wealthy merchants wanted to somehow justify the reduction of the ability of the kings to tax them. And they led a lot of the famous revolutions that we know that created the modern world. The French Revolution, the American Revolution were led by wealthy merchants. Okay. But at the same time as this sort of political pressure was emerging in Europe between merchants and their former feudal lords, this thing called science was emerging. And science, before, for example, science emerged when you wanted to know why there was a drought, or if you wanted to know why your cousin died early, or if you wanted to know why you weren't getting enough money for your crops, you asked the priest. You basically asked the church to give you those answers. But after the Enlightenment period, people started looking at people like scientists, philosophers, and eventually economists for the answers to those questions. So, science was emerging in this point of history. Western science, and that science had been theorizing the universe as being built of a number of little particles, atoms, right? And those particles kind of have their own volition, their own ideas. They want to do something, but they find themselves in a system, creating a system with other atoms, and those systems always find equilibrium or balance. That's the way modern physics looked. Think of planets finding equilibrium orbits around the sun. So it made sense for an economist to try and mimic the natural sciences by creating an economics that looked like the natural sciences. And it became a natural thought, of course, that the small particle that made up the world might be the individual human. So that's where Smith started his analysis. He theorized the economy as the result of free individuals trading goods. And he depicted humans as individual little particles. And in his words, these particles had the propensity to truck, barter, and exchange one thing for another. They bargained, tried to sell things, trade their work for some money, get money and buy things with it in order to just get more of what they wanted. But the magical thing about Smith's ideas was that this individual greed was somehow transformed, as if, he said, by an invisible hand, into something that maximized benefit for all people in society. And this was the first emergence of the theory of invisible hands in economics, that somehow individual greed is transformed into greater good. And that was the crux of Smith's theory of economics. From this type of thought emerged the four most impactful concepts of Adam Smith. These concepts are so impactful that they remain the four core concepts that are in every introductory economics textbook to this day in one form or another. The first of these concepts is this guy, Homo economicus. It's Latin. It means economic man. It's a description of what a human is. And as Smith initially described humans, they were selfish above all. A human is motivated to only get more of the things they want, and they will work for that. The second assumption in Homo economicus, part of the description of Homo economicus, is they have stable preferences. That is, their preferences don't really change. I like ice cream today. I'll like ice cream tomorrow. I always love ice cream. I like ice cream, right? That's a stable preference. Now, of course, people like more than one thing. So if you add up all the different things that people like, you get what economists now call a utility function. I like ice cream, I like pie, and I like running really fast. And that's in my utility function. I get a certain amount of utility or use or happiness, some people say, out of getting those things that I like. So my utility function in this example has pie, ice cream, and running really fast. And that's what I will work to get. Another assumption in Homo economicus is that this Homo economicus, economic man, is alone. It does not talk to other humans. It only looks at prices and decides whether it wants that thing at that price. And that's all you get. So if I like ice cream cones enough to pay more than $5 and ice cream cones only cost $5, I'm going to buy an ice cream cone. That's all that's there. Homo economicus does, in this concept, you don't imagine that this person is with their friends and will get an ice cream cone just because everybody else is getting an ice cream cone, or that they saw an ad for ice cream cones and that made them want ice cream cones. They're just alone, they like things they want, and they choose rationally based on prices. That's Homo economicus. The second concept that emerges from Smith is the idea of markets as natural. If you remember the description from the last slides, this Homo economicus person goes and is selfish, tries to get as much as they want by bartering and trucking, by exchanging goods and services. But out of that emerges an interaction in which there's a supply curve and a demand curve. People supply things that they have and they demand things that they want, and those meet at an equilibrium point. And remember, as if guided by an invisible hand. And this market is just a natural thing that emerges out of human selfish behavior. It arises out of the selfish actions of Homo economicus. The third major contribution of Adam Smith was that markets are self-regulating, that you should keep your hands off of it. governments shouldn't try and adjust them. They work perfectly and they create efficiency, growth, and progress if they're not interfered with. So the ideas that emerged out of Smith were that not only that there was a magical invisible hand governing individual behavior and putting it into an economy that has an equilibrium point, but it was also the idea that if you interfere with that operation of that market, you're going to do more harm than good. So what did that mean? Governments should not try to interfere with markets, even if they're doing it for the best interest of the population. A fourth major idea that comes from Adam Smith is this: specialization leads to growth. Smith talks a lot about division of labor in society, where you can have a baker, a butcher, or whatever. And he's talking in early industrialization, so he's got on his mind probably things like assembly lines within factories. He talks a lot about a pin factory in this regard, actually, that makes pins. But the idea is it's better, say, if you're going to build a house, to have a painter and an electrician and a plumber and a carpenter that are experts in their field, and then they cooperate to build the house. They cooperate through the market. They're trying to make money, right? That invisible hand is working. And they make the house. That's more efficient than just having one person who knows how to do all those things. That's the assumption. Specialization leads to more efficiency, which leads to more growth. Smith was talking in The Wealth of Nations about national economies and within an international system as well. And it followed from that it made sense more for nations to specialize on the things they're good at making and then trade with other nations to get the things that they're not so good at making, instead of a nation to say try and build everything within that nation that its population needs. These sort of four assumptions really depict a world in which markets are automatic and they're the result of a greedy human. And you might not like the way that human is depicted. You might not think humans are that way. And people picked up on that. For example, the famous economist John Maynard Keynes said of theories that came from Smith that it was the extraordinary belief that the nastiest of men, for the nastiest of reasons, will somehow work for the benefit of us all. But those four impactful ideas weren't all of what Adam Smith believed or all of what he wrote about. There was a lot of other things in Adam Smith's work that were kind of left out of the story of economics and the story of Adam Smith. So what were those things? Well, the first idea was that markets are constructed by government. Adam Smith lived, as I said, during the Enlightenment, but this was also the time of what was called the enclosure movement in England. Remember those rich merchants that had become wealthy during the colonial times? Well, they wanted to keep their wealth, as I've said. In England at the time, however, all lands were the property of the kings and the aristocrats. So there was a movement called enclosure that really became impactful once the merchants really took power. And that was to privatize all of this, which was essentially public land in England. And this happened in France and Germany and the rest of Europe as well, and is currently happening throughout the world, to tell you the truth. Now, what does enclosure mean? Imagine you're a bunch of peasants and you live on a feudal manor and you've been growing food and you keep some for your family and you give some away to the king and the aristocracy. That was the feudal system under the tyranny of kings in feudal times. Then the enclosure movement comes along. Your land is all of a sudden made private, but it's not made private in that you own it. It's made private in that anyone can own it. So who buys it? The wealthy merchants. The wealthy merchants purchase that land and then they move the peasants off the land. So you may have been poor before and a peasant, but you had food for your family. Now you don't even have land on which to grow that food. What happened to peasants in the enclosure movement? They became a workforce for industrial capitalists. Those merchants those wealthy merchants became owners of factories, essentially, and they needed workers. What happened? They enclosed the system of farmland in which people were surviving, removed the people from the farmland to create what Karl Marx later called a reserve army of the unemployed. And those unemployed went to find work in the factories. Of course, it was those merchants that tended to own the factories. So when you see that story of enclosure, what you see is a market being created by government by privatizing all the land and removing the peasants who were surviving off that land. They created a market for labor where those peasants had nothing to do to survive other than sell their own work to owners of factories. So Adam Smith saw that happening quite a lot. He saw that land was not a commodity to be bought and sold before, but was created as a commodity by a government. He saw that workers weren't bought and sold in that way before, but they were created as a commodity. So he lived through that, and he really had an understanding that markets are something that governments construct or societies construct. They're a social construct. He also believed that humans are not naturally greedy, and people don't usually realize this about Smith. His book before The Wealth of Nations was called The Theory of Moral Sentiments. And in that book, 1753, I believe, he described humans not as that Homo economicus thing, but as being ultimately motivated by moral sentiments, even empathy, the need to be with other humans. And he also described human wants, those utility functions, as being created by culture and society. So he described more of a Homo sociologicus than a Homo economicus. A third big piece that was left out of Smith is his belief that governments must regulate markets. He didn't trust these magical markets to work effectively in the benefit of all. Most of the text in that book, The Wealth of Nations, in which he describes his theory of markets, most of the text describes how those markets have to be watched and controlled by society because the wealthy who become rich in market systems will threaten democracy itself. He also described the many things that are not provided very well by markets, like roads, healthcare, things like that. And he also suggested that markets can very often make mistakes that need to be fixed by government. But these things were left out of the story of Adam Smith in most economics textbooks. So why was most of what Adam Smith wrote ignored? That's a good question, and we've already touched on it a little bit. First, this Enlightenment science. It was looking for what you would call linear models that aren't overly complicated. And linear models can have a natural balance. If something has a natural balance, there's no need for a third party or a third force to go in there and mess around. So if you just need mass and gravity to make planets go around the sun in a balanced orbit in an equilibrium, you don't need a government in there telling the planet what to do, right? These sort of linear models, which you can see here in depictions of planets orbiting the sun or electrons orbiting a nucleus, you can find equilibrium points using differential calculus. Now, that's hard math, most people would say, but it's not nearly as hard math as you'd have to do to figure out what would happen if these planets started talking with one another or interacting with one another in complicated ways, or what would happen if governments started getting involved in the orbits of the planets. It's easier math. So Enlightenment science was really looking for these elegant models that had very simple components that went into equilibrium, and that almost became an ideology. So it's no surprise that the market model followed that simplistic ideology. The second reason why most of what Adam Smith talked about was ignored was probably a different type of ideology that emerged in the Enlightenment, and that was that political ideology. Remember, those merchants who took control of the societies were afraid of the control of kings. They didn't want the kings in there telling what the economy should be doing. And to them, government was kind of the kings because they're just coming out of that old feudal era. So they really perpetuated an ideology that you have to keep government away from people's affairs. That's what the French Revolution and the American Revolution were largely fought over. But remember, those revolutions were fought and led by rich merchants. And remember, the democracy that emerged out of those revolutions really said that only rich white men could vote. So we can really see there who those revolutions were being fought for. But those people were powerful, and they wanted to create an ideology that was, it was a time of escape from the rule of government, especially the rule of authoritarian rulers, the kings and queens of Europe. So that really made its way into the science of the time. And that economic science was really designed to really work with that ideology that wanted to keep the rule of the kings out of the economic system. So that need for a simple and elegant mathematics of economics really shone with the next major political economist after Adam Smith, this guy, David Ricardo. Ricardo emphasized that political economy, as it was called at the time, should be a mathematical science. They're trying to be scientific. They're trying to mimic physics here. But for economics to be mathematical, it would require dropping politics altogether, because they figured ethics and political argument had to be out of the equation, because that complicates it. It complicates the math. They want a simple particle that seeks the things it wants and finds equilibrium. It also required unquestioning commitment to the Homo economicus model of humans, because they needed that simple particle in order to do the math. It couldn't be complicated. It couldn't go to parties and talk to its friends. It couldn't change its mind. Homo economicus. So Ricardo maintained these simplistic assumptions as much as possible to make the math work out well. He really wanted economics to be a mathematical science. And he also doubled down on the idea of comparative advantage from specialization, especially, and he's very famous for this, the idea of specialization amongst countries, that countries are better off if they produce according to what was called their comparative advantage, produce the good that they're best at producing. And every country does that, and then they trade, everyone will be better off. So specialization, don't have governments trying to interfere in markets to make countries produce things they're not already good at producing, and things like that. So he really followed up Adam Smith's model, but formalized it a bit more using mathematics. This guy is another famous historical classical political economist. In fact, John Stuart Mill is often thought of as the last classical political economist. Well, what does that mean? Well, this group of classical political economists, who include Adam Smith and David Ricardo, like we've just seen, they really use this thing called the labor theory of value. What did that mean? The labor theory of value was this idea that no matter what you had, it only has value once a human has labored on it, worked on it. For example, you can have a rock, but it's not worth anything until a human gets that rock and fashions it into a hammer. Then they can have a hammer that's worth something to some people. So this idea of the labor theory of value says really that all value in goods emerges from their labor. It's interesting to think of this, but it was assumed that once you include the labor theory of value in your economic theorizing, you are being political. Because if all labor, if all work is the source of all value, that means, well, you have to really care about what you pay your laborers. And what if you don't labor for work? What if you only own things, capital? You're a capitalist, for example. What if that's your contribution to the economy? Well, if the labor theory of value is held to, that means that your contribution as a capitalist isn't worth anything because it's not adding value. That is political. John Stuart Mill tried to sort of balance those equations by saying, yes, but if you have money, that creates value as well, but also the labor theory of value does as well. It didn't really work out for him to take the politics out of economics, though, because then you have this capital that how much is that value worth that the capital creates, the money and the raw materials owned by people? How much does that contribute to the value of a good? And how much does the labor contribute? As you can see in there, there's a conflict between who gets paid for what work. So it really didn't depoliticize economics, the work of John Stuart Mill, and maybe that's why he's considered the last political economist. He didn't believe that all people are selfish, but this is dependent on the social situation. If you make a market, for example, if you kick peasants off of the land and make them desperate laborers, well, they'll probably act very desperate and selfish in that sort of circumstance, but he didn't believe that that was the natural state of humans. So he didn't believe in Homo economicus, and he was a proponent of this laissez-faire type of economic sphere. Laissez-faire means like keep your hands off, free, keep your hands off of the market. Right? Laissez-faire markets are markets that are sort of generally freer from government intervention. He did think that the market was sort of a smarter sphere than maybe humans were, or the government. He kind of believed in that invisible hand, that market distribution, natural invisible hand distribution would distribute in a way that's smarter than maybe governments would. The idea of conflict between laborers and capitalists, for example, really finally was ejected from the science of economics by a revolution. Not the most exciting revolution in the world, more of a mathematical revolution, and this was called the marginalist revolution. The marginalist revolution suggested that the theory of value that should be followed shouldn't be the labor theory of value or any other theory of value. It should be this thing called the utility theory of value. And that is based on the idea of marginal utility and marginal benefits. It's a little complicated, but it exists in every introductory textbook, and they spend a good amount of time to teach you about marginal theories of value and things like that. But what the marginal theory of value does is allow perfectly for differential calculus to be used to calculate equilibrium points in markets. They can find that place where supply equals demand, so to speak, and find how much is purchased at that and at what price, to try and make economics a mathematical science. So marginal utility or utility theory of value is kind of like this. Here's an example of marginal utility calculations in economics. Maybe I like ice cream cones and it's a hot day. The ice cream truck guy comes by. I like ice cream cones so much that I'm willing to spend $7 on an ice cream cone. I look at the price, it's $5. Great. The next unit of ice cream that I want to buy, I value it $7. It's only $5. I'll make that calculation. I will buy that ice cream. So I eat that and I'm still hungry and I still value ice cream. How much do I value it? A little less because I'm kind of full. Maybe though I'm willing to pay $5 for another ice cream at that point. I look at the price of ice cream. Oh, $5. I've actually got a consumer surplus here. My first purchase, I would have paid $7 for it, but I only had to pay $5. So good for me. Consumer surplus, that's called. But now I buy a $5 ice cream cone that I value $5. I don't get another consumer surplus, but I get happiness, utility from that ice cream cone. Now I've eaten two. And I'm thinking, I could eat another ice cream cone, but I don't value it as much because I'm getting kind of full. But I'd pay $3 for an ice cream cone. I look at the price of ice cream, it's $5. I won't buy it. So that's how economists tend to look at pricing and utility. It's about the value that you place on that last unit that you bought, the marginal unit. We don't need to go into the details of those calculations. You do that in a normal intro economics course and do all sorts of exercises based on that. But what's important is that when we include marginal value in the cost of everything, we can calculate equilibria through differential calculus. And it places the value of everything on utility. Instead of trying to think of, well, do laborers create all value or do capitalists, we start saying, no, value only exists if there's a want for something. It's on the other side of the equation, the demand side. So people want ice cream, therefore it has value. We don't have to talk about politics of who should get more, labor or capital, in that sort of scenario. And so the marginalist revolution really depoliticized economics, right? So this is what determines the price or the value of goods, is this demand side, this utility. But it does determine the demand for labor, so the price of labor is on the demand side, and things like that. So marginalists can calculate mathematical equilibria, therefore they start to believe more in equilibria, and it becomes economics a place where you see a lot of derivatives being written on chalkboards and things like that. But this mathematics has completed the transition from classical political economy into economics. Now, this economics that relies on that marginal revolution has a specific name, and it's very important: neoclassical economics. So now we've transitioned from classical political economy, Adam Smith, Ricardo, etc., to neoclassical economics. And this guy, Alfred Marshall, he's considered the first neoclassical economist. And really, these are just economists that use that marginal theory of value and utility theory of value. So they believe that all agreements are voluntary and involve rational decisions based on individual marginal utility, as we discussed. And under perfect conditions, they believe that the market is self-regulating, leading to efficiency in equilibrium. That is what the discipline of economics is that you see in introductory textbooks. They believe in this concept of Pareto optimality, which we'll get to at a later date. But that is optimality in which the economy is working at perfect equilibrium, and there's a belief that under perfect conditions, markets find that sweet spot. And enticingly, mathematicians can find that sweet spot through too, and put it on chalkboards, and it makes them feel, I guess, kind of fancy.